was some of the criticisms that I got of the three worlds model. I got a few different criticisms. One of them is, what do you mean it's just now the negative world? It's been the negative world a long time. I was getting hated back in the 90s. I was getting hated back in the 70s. It's the same old negative world it's always been. Christians have always been hated. There's some validity to this view. And so one of the things that I have done is refactored the way I talked about the positive world to make sure that I articulate that it really covers this period of decline from, say, 64 to 94. I'm not talking about 1950 or 1890 or something of that nature, or 1630. Christianity in the positive world is in a period of decline in America. All is not going well there. And it's also the case that Christians have, in some level, always had to deal with opposition at some level or another. Many abolitionists, for example, weren't necessarily welcomed by everyone in society. So yes, it has always been the case that there have been Christians who have suffered for some aspect of their faith. It doesn't mean everything was rosy in the positive world. Nevertheless, Christianity as a whole was still by and large seen positively in society, and Christian moral norms were still normative. One thing I like to use as an example of that is going back to the Gary Hart presidential scandal in 1987. It was reported that he had had a young woman stay overnight in his townhouse in Washington, D.C., and he was forced to drop out of the presidential race over that. By the time you get to Bill Clinton in the neutral world, or with the Lewinsky scandal, or when you get to Donald Trump with the Access Hollywood tape, things are completely different. So as late as 1987, having an affair could torpedo your career. Goes to show you that the world was just very, very different back then. Another criticism that I received is, in essence, a rejection of Christendom. And what do I mean by that? People will come back and they will say, well, Aaron, you can say it was the positive world for Christianity in the 1950s, but we had Jim Crow legislation. We had a lot of racial segregation in our country. We had slavery going back here. There were so many evils and injustices in our society that we cannot say that this was a Christian nation or it was positive towards Christianity because of these injustices. And I call this a rejection of Christendom because what we see is throughout the period of Christendom, there have been profound injustices in the world. And yet, the reason that we call them injustices, and virtually all of the opposition to those injustices, happened within essentially a Christian framework. The civil rights movement was largely built on arguments by people like the Reverend Martin Luther King about biblical justice and Christian justice and why society was not living up to it. So, in essence, even to critique the injustices of society required a somewhat of a Christian lens on the problem. And to say that there's nothing distinctly Christian or positive towards Christianity in a Christendom society sort of implies, well, there's no difference between that and pagan society, Greco-Roman society. When in fact, I think there was something different there. And so I would agree there are many profound injustices throughout history, even including areas you might think of as positive towards Christianity. Nevertheless, these were still ultimately societies that were Christian and simply not living up to the Christian ideals, embodying the original sin and the fall that is present in the world. Another criticism that people may have made is that the negative world is overly focused on changes around sexual norms. One reason I picked 2014 as the start date is it was right before the Obergefell decision that legalized gay marriage. So there's certainly been a sea change in sexual ethics. I would say that it goes beyond sexuality. Again, the Great Awakening, and that's a term that lefty writers like Matthew Iglesias used in Vox. It's not my analysis or some right-wing critics' analysis. This obsession with race and social justice, which can be attested to through massive increases in the number of uses of terms like racism or white supremacy in the media during this time frame, really hit around 2014. Something really changed in Obama's second term in America. Jonathan Haidt talks about how he started to notice a change on campus around 2013. There was something that happened in this country, and it had a profound impact on our society. Just think about the election of Donald Trump. How does that happen? Clearly, there's been a cultural break that happened circa 2014 in the country. And I'm not wedded to the negative world lens. As I always like to say, frameworks like these are not arguments about theology. This is not an argument about the Trinity, where I'm making a claim to objective truth. What I'm doing is trying to equip people with frameworks and tools to help them make sense of the world and navigate this new world that we're in. I think my model illuminates certain aspects of the problem very well, but there may well be other ways to look at the problem that might be more useful for other people. So perhaps someone has a different explanation of this cultural break and what it portends. But if you can't give an account of what happened, again, sometime in President Obama's second term, then I think you're really missing kind of the lived experience or lived reality that people have in the country. I, by nature, probably better align with the cultural engagement community. I grew up in a rural, Pentecostal, fundamentalist environment that was definitely culture war. I grew up watching the 700 Club on TV in the 1980s, but when I went to college, I then got a job in Chicago, and I lived in the city, and I rode public transit. In fact, I had an entire career as an urban policy analyst. I've interviewed Ed Glazer about his book, The Triumph of the City. I love the arts, and I love all the things that are present in the city. I like reading elite publications a lot more than I like listening to red meat political right blogs. And so when I talk about this cultural engagement crowd, I am analyzing them to be sure, but I'm also writing from personal experience, what I am seeing and what I am experiencing in my own life, and from the many people that I'm going to church with and I'm engaging with around. So this is a community that I am probably more tightly connected with and more dispositionally aligned with. And that may be why I more see some of the faults in them than maybe others do. I'm definitely not opposed to them. In fact, I think they got a lot right, and that needs to be carried forward into the negative world. They're not anti-intellectual like too much of the Protestant world has been, or certainly the evangelical world has been. They understand the value of elite culture and institutions. They understand that some things actually are good today. It's good to have good artisanal bread. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very trendy today on the internet to make fun of people who like to drink, craft IPAs or whatever. But it's good that we can actually enjoy living in America, which is a great country still in so many ways. So this positivity, I think that they had about certain aspects of the culture, and they're not just bashing on society all the time, but it's also very clear. This is the group that has the most to lose. This is the group that's most vulnerable because they're living in this milieu where the pressures of the negative world are most intense. If you're back home in rural Indiana, like my mom, the negative world probably doesn't affect you. She's retired on a government pension. If you're working for a major consulting firm in Chicago, like I did, your world is a lot different. It's very different if you're working in a Fortune 500 company in Seattle. So this world is just very different, and this is the place where the pressure is bearing down the hardest. I'm actually optimistic about the future of Christianity and evangelicalism in America. In some quarters, there's a lot of doom and gloom. People will talk about this book, The Last Pagan Generation, about how the pagan faith went extinct at the end of the Roman Empire. I don't think that's going to happen here. I certainly don't think that it's fated to happen here. Evangelicalism gets a lot of knocks for a lot of things, but but it also has a lot of strengths and virtues, and one of them is its adaptability. This is a movement that has been able to adapt to many different geographies, many different times and places, many different cultural conditions. So I think it has in its DNA the ability to adapt to the negative world. Again, we have to think differently about how we live in the negative world, but I think we can very much do that. And I don't think in the negative world that there's just going to be one strategy for the age or two strategies for the age. I think there are going to be multiple strategies that emerge. I think we need to have multiple strategies. I think we need to have less formula and cookbook approaches. I think we need to have trial and error. We're going to need to constantly adapt as the world continues to rapidly change. But I think that it's something that we can do. To help the church adapt to the negative world, I and some others co-founded a new nonprofit called American Reformer. And we are trying to bring the best of the Protestant tradition to bear on the problems of today. It's not enough just to critique wokeness. What should Christians be thinking and doing about race? We want to think about that. We've written a lot about political theology. What should the relationship between the church and the state be? How should Christians and the church engage politically, if at all? And we're doing that, again, through the lens of what Protestants have always taught, going back to the Reformers themselves, or even back to some of the pre-Reformation figures like Thomas Aquinas. But a big chunk of that is thinking about how we live in the negative world. I want to give an example of a way that pastors and churches might want to be thinking differently about doing church in the negative world. If you see the surveys, pastors are under enormous stress. Increasing numbers of people are thinking about leaving the ministry. And in fact, we're seeing lots of people are leaving the ministry. Even people who are not under clouds of scandals, just people who are just walking away saying, I can't take the stress. Pastors are being pressured from both sides, from culture war people, from cultural engagement people, from this people, from that people. Do you require Mass? Do you not require Mass? Do you have church? Do you do virtual? You're not going to be able to please everybody. And so pastors need to be structuring their ministry and structuring their lives for the maximum amount of strength and resiliency in the face of these kinds of pressures that are bearing down. And I'll give you two examples of people who are doing that. One is a Presbyterian minister by the name of C.R. Wiley. He's written some books. You can look them up on Amazon. He, several years back, started acquiring rental real estate. And he now has a small portfolio of buildings with tenants in them that provide him with rental income. And so because he has rental income, his entire livelihood is not at stake on staying popular at church. He is able to stand firm on theology, knowing that if he were to get fired because he fell afoul of his congregation for stating what he genuinely believed to be true, he would have fallback sources of income. Another pastor that I know, Michael Foster in Ohio, he's structuring so that everyone in ministry at his church is bivocational. He has a job. He's a part-time employee of the church. And this, again, reduces the financial overhead of the church, makes the church less vulnerable to declines in giving, and also, gives him, again, freedom to be bold in his preaching and not have to feel like he has to be a crowd pleaser or a man pleaser in order to keep a paycheck. So I think about the way pastors financially structure their lives, but in other ways, how do you structure your lives to reduce risk, reduce stress, to handle the pressures of the negative world, to handle the pressures of this intra-evangelical conflict and realignment that's going on? Another one is, friends and mentors. You've got to have people that you're close with, that you can draw strength from, that can encourage you, that can build you up. These are the sorts of things that need to happen. As I said, I'm planning to spend the coming months and years thinking about and developing strategies for the negative world. And I want to lay out just one today, which is that we have to be all in on Christianity. If you go back to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus contrasts the person who builds his house on a rock with the person who builds his house on the sand. And in that story, what is the difference between the two? It's actually whether they hear the words that he said and do them. You actually have to obey, and that is the instructions we're giving for surviving the flood. Well, the flood is coming. We have to be all in. We have to be obedient to the word, not just in exquisitely curated selections of scriptures that we like, but all of it. Another thing that I come back to is what Paul talks about with the overseers, about being above reproach. It's really distressing to me to see the number of scandals in the church, abuse scandals, financial scandals, sex scandals. It's terrible. And we do not have our house in order. And I think there's always going to be scandals, there's always going to be sins, because we're all fallen humans, and there's a lot of evangelicals, and when you have so many millions of them, there's always going to be a lot of people. Nevertheless, we as people need to be thinking, how do we obey? How can we walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which we've been called? How can we be above reproach? That is just something that's going to be increasingly important as we try to go into this negative world. We're not going to make it as lukewarm people, right? We're not going to make it as people dragging around a lot of unrepentant, unmortified sin. We have to go all in and make a decision that we are going to hold firm to the end.